Someone introduces themselves. You smile, you shake their hand, you make eye contact. You're present, you're warm, you're genuinely trying. And then, pause, let it land. 3 seconds later, it's gone. The name, quiet disbelief, completely gone. You replay the moment in your head, slow, searching, you try to reconstruct it. Nothing comes back. Just the memory of their face, the handshake, maybe the way they smiled. But the name? Soft, resigned. It never really landed. So now you're standing there, mid-conversation, slightly tense, understated, working around it, avoiding the moment you'll have to introduce them to someone else, hoping nobody asks, quietly calculating how long you can go before it becomes obvious. And somewhere in the back of your mind, heavy, familiar, a familiar thought surfaces. Slow, almost a whisper. What is wrong with me? Here's the thing most people never stop to question. Calm, deliberate shift in tone. We've been taught, socially, culturally, almost instinctively, that forgetting someone's name means you weren't paying attention, that it signals disrespect, that people who remember names are more present, more caring, more socially intelligent. But what if that entire assumption is backwards? Gentle challenge, curious lift. What if the people who forget names most easily are actually the ones paying the deepest kind of attention? Meaningful pause, just not to the part we've been trained to notice. Research in cognitive psychology and social neuroscience has started pointing towards something that most people find genuinely surprising. Steady, credible. The individuals who struggle most with name retention are often the same individuals who demonstrate the highest sensitivity to emotional atmosphere, the sharpest reading of social dynamics, and the most vivid long-term memory for how people made them feel. Not worse at connecting, clear, firm. Different at connecting. And that difference runs deeper than a simple memory quirk. It reaches into how your brain prioritizes experience, how your nervous system processes social information, and ultimately, what kind of mind you're actually working with. That moment of forgetting, soft reframe. It wasn't carelessness. It was your brain making a choice, a very fast, very specific choice about what mattered most in that moment. And understanding why it made that choice, quiet intrigue, will tell you something about yourself that most people spend their whole lives never thinking to ask. Think about what actually happens in the first few seconds of meeting someone. Inviting, pull the listener in. Your brain isn't passively receiving information, slight intensity. It's working hard. It's scanning their face for familiarity, reading the micro expressions around their eyes, picking up the warmth or absence of it in their voice, measuring the energy in the room, deciding almost instantly whether this person feels safe, interesting, familiar, or threatening. All of that happens before they've finished saying their name. And here's the part that changes everything. Calm but significant. Your brain has a limit, grounded, factual. Psychologists call it working memory bandwidth, the amount of information your mind can actively hold and process at one moment. It's not infinite, it's surprisingly small. And when something fills it first, everything arriving after gets filtered. Not forgotten, pointed clear. Filtered. There's a difference. When you're absorbing someone's energy, reading their tone, feeling the social weight of a first impression, building slowly, you're using that bandwidth. All of it. Sometimes more than all of it. And then the name arrives. Quiet, almost gentle. Just a sound, a short, arbitrary sequence of syllables with no color, no texture, no emotional charge attached to it. Your brain receives it, but there's nowhere meaningful to put it. The space is already occupied by something your mind decided mattered more. Psychologists call this selective encoding. Your brain doesn't record experience like a camera. It curates it. It makes rapid, largely unconscious decisions about what gets stored and what gets released. For people who are highly observant, warm recognition, emotionally sensitive, socially attuned, those decisions happen faster and more intensely. The person in front of them registers deeply and immediately. The name arriving at the exact same moment simply doesn't compete. So you weren't distracted when you forgot that name. Reassuring, steady. You were fully engaged, slightly lifted, just with something your brain rated as more significant.
The name was lost not because the person didn't matter, slow, deliberate, but because in a very real neurological sense, they mattered too much for the name to get through. And the science behind why names specifically are so difficult to hold. Curious, inviting. In the 1980s, a storytelling mode, warm, a psychologist named Gillian Cohen designs an experiment that still puzzles people when they first hear about it. She told one group of participants that a man they were about to meet worked as a baker. She told another group that the same man's last name was Baker. Measured, carefully setting it up. Same word, same sound, completely different results. The people who learned his profession remembered it easily. The people who learned his last name forgot it almost immediately. This became known as the Baker-Baker paradox, slight gravity, and it quietly revealed something profound about how human memory actually works. When you hear the word baker as job, as a description, your brain doesn't just store the word, it pulls on an entire network of associations. The smell of bread, the warmth of an oven, a specific image, maybe from childhood, a feeling of something familiar and grounded. Memory doesn't store isolated facts, clear, grounded. It stores connections. The more connections a piece of information has, the more securely it anchors in your mind. But a name? Soft contrast. A name like Baker or James or Sarah or Michael arrives without any of that. It has no smell, no texture, no story attached to it in that moment. It floats into your working memory, drifting light, with nothing to grab onto. Neuroscientists describe names as neurologically orphaned information. They exist in isolation, and isolated information with no web of meaning to hold it in place fades almost immediately under normal conditions. The conditions for remembering a name are actually quite specific, calm, explanatory. You need repetition, or you need an emotional anchor, a strong enough feeling attached to the moment that the name gets pulled along with it into long-term storage. Most introductions offer neither. Plain honest. You hear a name once, slow, in a loud room or a busy hallway or a moment already crowded with social pressure. You're managing your expression, calibrating your handshake, forming a first impression, building slightly breathless, all simultaneously. The name had no chance. Quiet, final. And for minds that are already processing more of the social environment than average, meaningful pause, the odds were even smaller from the start. But here's what that same science reveals about what was being stored instead. Gentle turn, curiosity building. You've met this person, warm, familiar. They shake your hand, hear your name once, and then use it 3 times in the next 5 minutes. Slight wonder. Naturally, effortlessly, like they've known you for years. And somewhere in the back of your mind, you think, quiet envy, curiosity. How do they do that? It feels like a gift, reflective, like some people are simply wired to make others feel remembered, while you're standing there hoping nobody asks you to introduce the person next to you. But here's what that person isn't telling you, leaning in, conspiratorial warmth. It isn't effortless, clear, grounded. It's a system. Research on social memory shows that people with strong name recall almost always use deliberate encoding strategies, measured, informative, techniques that either been taught or developed on their own. They repeat the name immediately out loud. They link it to a physical feature. They build a quick internal story, light illustrative. James, red tie, works in finance, reminds me of my cousin. They're essentially doing a rapid mental filing, efficient, almost clinical, at the exact moments of introduction. And here's the crucial detail, slow emphasis. Your brain has attention to pay a wage to that filing. Now, think about where your attention goes in that same moment. Soft pivot, introspective. Not outward, quiet, certain. Inward, you're beating the dynamic, gentle rhythm, feeling the energy of the room, noticing something slightly uncomfortable in the way the conversation started, wondering how you came across, processing the whole emotional texture of the interaction simultaneously. Your attention is just as active, reassuring, firm, possibly more so. It's just aimed at a completely different layer of the experience. Psychologists describe this as the difference between external focus and internal processing during social encoding. Neither is superior, authoritative but warm. They produce different results. External focus captures names. Internal processing captures meaning, atmosphere, and emotional truth. The person who remembers your name may not remember how the conversation actually felt. The person who forgets your name probably remembers it with surprising accuracy. This isn't a consolation prize for validating. It's a genuine cognitive distinction. You weren't absent in that moment, warm, reassuring. You were somewhere else entirely, somewhere most people never think to look. And when anxiety enters the picture, slight gravity, that inward pull becomes even stronger. Which brings us to something that almost nobody talks about honestly. Meeting someone new is more demanding than it looks, grounded in matter of fact. Even in a casual setting, a party, a work introduction, a friend of a friend, building steadily, your brain is running an enormous number of processes simultaneously. Reading social cues, managing your body language, choosing words, monitoring tone, forming impressions, deciding how much of yourself to reveal. That's already a significant cognitive load. Pause to land. Now add anxiety. Quiet, weighted. When anxiety activates, even mild, low-level anxiety, careful, deliberate, the brain doesn't just add stress to the situation. It reorganizes its priorities.
Mode focused on monitoring and managing. It starts scanning for potential threats. It rehearses responses before you've finished hearing the question. It dedicates serious mental resources to self-presentation, making sure you seem okay, seem normal, seem like you belong in this room. Researchers at the University of Toronto found that anxious individuals show measurably reduced capacity to encode new verbal information in high-stimulation social environments. In plain terms, when you're nervous, your brain is full. There's simply no space left for a name to land. And this doesn't require a clinical anxiety disorder. It doesn't require panic or visible discomfort. It applies to anyone who feels the quiet, ordinary pressure of meeting someone new, the mild self-consciousness that most people experience and almost nobody admits to. That pressure is enough. It fills the room in your working memory that a name would need to occupy. So the name arrives at the single worst possible moment, the moment when your mind is most occupied, most activated, most pointed inward, and it passes through without ever finding a place to settle. What's important to understand is this. The forgetting isn't a sign of not caring. It's often a sign of caring too much, about the impression, about the connection, about whether you're showing up the way you want to. The minds that forget names most easily are frequently the minds most invested in how human interactions feel. And what those minds do manage to hold on to, despite everything, is perhaps the most revealing part of this entire picture. Try this thought experiment. Think of someone you met years ago, someone whose name you almost certainly don't remember, a person from a party, a conference, a waiting room, a brief chapter of your life that is mostly faded. Now ask yourself, what do you remember? For most people who forget names easily, the answer comes quickly, and it's surprisingly detailed. You remember whether they made you feel comfortable or slightly on edge. You remember the moment the conversation shifted from surface level to something real. You remember a particular laugh or a pause that felt significant, or the specific kind of warmth they carried when they listened to you. You remember, in other words, who they were, not what they were called. Psychologists have a term for this. They call it episodic memory bias toward emotional salience. Your brain records experience selectively, and what it selects is emotional weight. The moments that mattered get stored with depth and texture. The details that carried no emotional charge, a name, a job title, a specific date, devastated. This isn't a malfunction. It's a feature of how emotionally attuned memory systems work. Research in social neuroscience has found that individuals with strong emotional memory often show heightened activity in the amygdala during social interactions, the brain's primary emotional processing center. Their nervous systems are essentially more reactive to the human element of an encounter, which means they encode the human element more deeply. They're not forgetting, they're remembering differently. Not in names and labels, in feelings, impressions, and the invisible architecture of how a moment actually felt. Think about what that means for a moment. The person who forgot your name after one meeting might be the same person who could describe years later the exact emotional quality of the conversation you had, whether you seemed confident or quietly uncertain, whether the exchange felt genuine or slightly performative,
whether something real passed between you or whether it stayed on the surface. That's not a lesser form of memory. In many ways, it's a more human one. But it raises a question that goes deeper than memory, deeper than names or anxiety or attention styles. It asks something about the fundamental way certain minds experience other people, and why some brains are built to feel first and label second. There are two fundamentally different ways a human mind can encounter another person. The first way, break them into parts: name, job, location, mutual connections. File each piece separately, build a picture from the components up. The second way, absorb the whole thing at once. The feeling they carry, the energy underneath their words, the unspoken thing happening between what they say and what they mean. Most people lean toward one of these without ever realizing it, and the lean shapes almost everything about how they move through social life. Gestalt psychology, one of the oldest frameworks in perceptual science, describes this as a foundational difference in how minds organize experience. Analytic processors decompose. They separate experience into distinct, manageable units and store those units individually. This works exceptionally well for names, dates, and categorical information. The mind has a labeled drawer for each piece. Holistic processors do something different. They perceive the gestalt, the unified whole, before they ever reach the parts. The overall impression arrives first, fully formed, rich with texture and feeling. The individual components, including the name, arrive later, or sometimes not at all, because the whole already feels complete without them. Here's where it gets genuinely interesting. For a holistic processor, an isolated name disconnected from feeling, from context, from emotional meaning, doesn't fit naturally anywhere. It's a fragment without a home. The mind received the whole person. A name alone feels like an arbitrary label attached to something already fully understood. This isn't a storage failure. It's an architectural difference in how experience gets organized. And this cognitive style doesn't exist in isolation. Personality research consistently links holistic processing to a trait psychologists call openness to experience, one of the 5 core dimensions of human personality. People high in openness tend toward creativity, depth of feeling, sensitivity to atmosphere, and a natural pull toward meaning beneath the surface. They're drawn to the why behind things. They notice what most people miss, not because they're trying harder, but because their perceptual system is tuned to a different frequency. The same trait that makes someone forget a name in the first 30 seconds of meeting you is often the same trait that makes them understand something true about you before the conversation is even finished. Think about that for a moment. The person who couldn't remember your name at the party, they may have read your energy more accurately than anyone else in the room. They may have noticed the thing you were carrying quietly beneath your words. They may have left that conversation knowing something real about you that the person who remembered your name perfectly never thought to look for. Forgetting the label doesn't mean missing the person. Sometimes it means the person was so fully received that the label became irrelevant. That's not a lesser form of memory. It's the signature of a particular kind of mind, one that was built from the ground up to feel first. And understanding that about yourself changes something. Not just about memory, about identity. Come back to that moment at the beginning. The handshake, the smile, the name that disappeared before you could catch it. You spent years reading that moment as evidence of something wrong with you, unattentive, careless, socially inadequate. You apologized for it, worked around it, quietly felt embarrassed by it. But look at what actually happened in that moment. You read the room. You absorbed the person, their energy, their warmth or guardedness, the emotional weather they carried with them. You stored something that cannot be faked, cannot be performed, and cannot be retrieved by someone who wasn't truly paying attention. You stored how they made you feel. That is not a lesser form of memory. It is not a consolation prize for the thing you failed to retain. It is a different relationship with human experience entirely. Your brain is not broken. It is not undertrained or careless or socially behind. It is wired to receive people at a depth that most memory systems never reach, and the cost of that depth is occasionally losing the label while keeping everything that actually mattered. You're not forgetting people, you're feeling them fully in the way that leaves a mark long after the name has faded. And here's the thought worth sitting with. If the way you process people, this holistic, emotionally driven, feeling first way of moving through the world shapes how you remember names, what else does it shape? How you form attachments, how you read conflict, how you experience loneliness or belonging, or the particular ache of feeling deeply understood by someone for the first time. The pattern doesn't stop at memory. It runs through everything. And if that idea is already forming into a question in your mind, if you're already sensing that this is connected to something larger about who you are and how you experience other people, then the next video might be exactly where that question leads.